Greetings, everybody. It is 7:30 in the Central Time Zone. And for those of you that are here, welcome. For those of you watching on Facebook Live, good evening. I hope you've had a good week and that you're safe and that you've done something good and interesting in your life this week. So thank you all for watching Goodbye Columbus. Today we have a very, very special guest. For those of you in the Dallas area that read the Dallas Morning News, you have been reading Michael Granberry's work for a long time. On the Sunday Dallas Morning News, the arts section has a rich blend of a lot of things from the arts, and Michael has at least one story almost every week and is currently, as soon as we're done tonight, he is chasing one more story. So we are so happy to have you, Michael. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you.
So Michael, why did you choose this film? Because this was, when you ask you, what would you like to do? This is what you picked. Why did you pick this?
Well, it was on my mind because I recently did an interview with Blake Bailey, whose definitive biography on Philip Roth was released on Tuesday, April 6th.
Mhm.
And I knew that I was going to be writing this story for the morning news about Bailey. It's online right now, as a matter of fact, at dallasnews.com. If you go to our website, you can read it. This guy has written a number of so-called definitive biographies. John Cheever was one. And he was more or less selected by Philip Roth to do his biography. And I knew I had this story coming up, and a big part of the book is Goodbye Columbus, which was Philip Roth's very first published work. It was a series of stories. Goodbye Columbus is kind of the headline story, and it was called a novella, not a novel, but a novella. And it's one of a series of stories in his first book, which won the National Book Award. He wrote, this was published when he was 26 years old. And then of course it was published in 59. 10 years later, it becomes a movie that won a Golden Globe Award for the lead actress, Ali MacGraw. And so I thought it would be interesting to watch that film, although other films have been made of his work. Because like if you read Blake's book, a lot of the controversy that has swirled around Roth over the years began with that book, began with the very first book.
So do you want to just tell us a little bit more about Philip Roth for those who I assume everybody knows, but so he starts with this novella, and then where does he go from here? And what is the take of this biography about Roth?
Well, this is really interesting. There's a quote here from Blake in my story, which I think kind of sums it up. It kind of sums up. It's a perfect answer to your question. And this is Blake's quote. In 2006, the New York Times canvassed 200 literary critics, professors, etc., to name the best American novel of the last 25 years. On the final list of 22 books, 6 were by Philip Roth. And bear in mind that his career was 55 years long. Bailey calls Roth, quote, a figure of vast international and cultural importance. His work is magnificent and deserves to endure. Along with Saul Bellow and Bernard Malamud, his is the last word on the Jewish experience in America. One of the things that's interesting to me, since I grew up in Texas, I saw my introduction to Roth was the movie Goodbye Columbus, which came out when I was a senior in high school.
Mm.
And as soon as it came out, that was Samuell High School in Pleasant Grove. I watched it that year. And as we were discussing earlier, before the panel began, there were so many movies of my late adolescence, I guess, that were so groundbreaking. The Graduate in 1967 being my favorite, and then Goodbye Columbus in 1969. These were movies that really pushed the envelope in terms of the R rating, right?
Hmm.
And one of the funny story that I was going to tell you about Goodbye Columbus is, here I grow up in this Southern Baptist family in Pleasant Grove, and I go to SMU, and I go to freshman orientation, and I didn't know what they were going to do at freshman orientation. So the dean of housing gets up there and he says, "Well, guess what? Good news. I know you kids will enjoy this. We have a movie for you tonight, and the movie that we're going to show you is Goodbye Columbus.
Mm.
And I'm going to show you this movie, and I just want you to know that this movie deals in part with birth control. And I know that a lot of you kids are going to have sex here at SMU, or you probably already are. So I just want you to know that we have plenty of birth control available at the Student Health Center." And that was his introduction to the movie, right? And I thought, wow, this would have never happened at Samuell High School in Pleasant Grove, right? So there was that. And
That
then
is just so amazing
yeah,
because it's Southern Methodist University,
right,
and
right.
this is a very Jewish film.
It is.
And that's, you
Yeah.
know, there were some people who watched that film with you who probably didn't know anybody that was Jewish.
That's entirely possible. I mean, there were Jewish students at SMU. I don't remember many. We had one Jewish student at Samuel High School. He's still a dear friend of mine, Joe Goldblatt. You may remember his father, Max Goldblatt, who was a
Oh,
Dallas city councilman.
yes, Max.
And Joe teaches in Scotland now. He's a professor in Scotland. But
Okay, so Michael, so you watch this film, you've seen
yeah,
it already, right? But
yeah,
you're watching it at SMU,
that was my second time, right?
and you were not at this point. What? How familiar were you with the Jewish experience in general as a boy growing up in that environment?
Not at all. I mean, really, I learned most of what I know about the Jewish experience from my wife. My wife Nancy is a Jewish girl from the Bronx,
Mhm.
and I think I told you earlier, she does not like Goodbye Columbus. She does not like the movie. She
Yeah.
does not like the story. And she has a lot of problems with Philip Roth in general, and she is not alone. But but I would say that I learned most, the most about Jewish culture from Nancy and her family. We've been married over 30 years now. And speaking of Nancy, I mean, one of the intriguing things about reading this Roth biography, Blake Bailey is such a good biographer because he really takes a deep dive into Philip Roth. Like, you learn in the beginning of the book, you learn that the Roth family came, as many Ashkenazi Jews who came to America did. They came from Poland, right? He came from the exact same area where where the maternal side of Nancy's family came from Bialystok, Poland. The bialy that you order at the bagel shop,
Yeah.
that comes from Bialystok, right? That comes from that word, right?
People don't eat bialys anymore.
That's
That's
right.
not
I
not
haven't
in
had one in
Dallas. You can't get a bialy
I
anyplace.
haven't had one in years. But what was so weird about reading the book is I have been to Bialystok with Nancy. We went there in 1990. We also went to Auschwitz. We went to Warsaw. And his family basically came from that same region, and they experienced many of the same problems, including the Nazi invasion in June of 41, when they invaded that area of Poland. And it's a very sad story. Nancy's great great grandmother on her mother's side, she was one of about 2,000 Jews that was herded into the synagogue in Bialystok. They were put in the synagogue, and the doors were locked, and the synagogue was set on fire, and they all died inside there. And many of these kinds of things happened to Roth's relatives as well, right? And
And of course, there are some people in the world who believe none of that really happened.
oh, please, please, I just I have no patience for this stuff anymore,
Yeah. So, uh, getting back to the film, when you saw it for the first time, not knowing very many people that were Jewish, how did you feel about the film? Because you obviously liked it a lot, but what? Because you didn't know people that you had nothing to sort of refer this to. It's like this is all
Right.
you knew.
Well, I'll tell you, I had a different, and Nancy and I have talked about this movie and the book a lot, and I had a very different reaction.
Mm,
And and I shared this with Blake Bailey, and he said to me that he had the same reaction. I related to this movie as a class struggle, right? The Richard Benjamin character is from a lower class, middle class, lower middle class Jewish family. They are nothing like on a socioeconomic level, on an economic level, they are nothing like the family of Brenda Patimkin, played by Ali McGraw. This is a
mm,
well-to-do, affluent Jewish family. The reason I could relate to that is, I feel that Dallas is a city, my native city, is to this day really sharply defined by class struggles. Like the area south of downtown is very different from the area north of downtown, right?
yeah.
And, I remember growing up in Pleasant Grove, which was a working class community. We would play football against Highland Park, and there were always, these insults. Oh, your mother, you know what? Your mothers are our maids, right? And this was basically the trash talk. And so there was always this class divide. And as a result, kids from Samuel, who played sports, they loved to beat Highland Park whenever they got the chance, right? Didn't happen often. That's a great sports school, as you know. But I kind of identified with what Richard Benjamin, I think, was feeling in terms of the class struggle. He felt kind of alienated from a class that was very different from his own, right? And Bailey sort of agreed with me, but I tell you what, Bart, I think I should share with you as we're talking.
Yeah.
I'm looking at some of these quotes from this. Bailey had this very interesting quote about Goodbye Columbus, and if you want, I'll
Oh,
share with
please
you
do.
what he
I was
said.
actually going to ask you. It's like, so what does he say about Goodbye Columbus?
So I write in the story. So why was Goodbye Columbus so controversial? For one, Bailey says the 1959 publication of Roth's debut coincided with the release of Leon Uris's Exodus
Exodus.
and the Broadway release of The Diary of Anne Frank.
Mm,
Quote, Holocaust consciousness, Bailey says, was very much on the rise. Apart from its obvious tragic dimension, the Holocaust was terribly shaming, that a whole ethnicity of people was viewed to be lower than animals and to be caricatured as they are in Goodbye Columbus as parvenu vulgarians enjoying the country club life in a sort of parody of country club life because they're so vulgar and unassimilated was deeply shaming. But to others, Goodbye Columbus felt more like a bitter class struggle than an exercise in Jewish self hatred. Quote, very much so, Bailey says, comparing it to, quote, a Gatsby story, the poor boy who aspires to marry the rich girl. So,
and I think that's very well written because it is both of those things.
mhm.
And thinking about the Holocaust, and it's not that far away from the Holocaust at that time when the novella
Yeah,
comes out, and
that's
then
right.
certainly when we get to 69, it's a little further away, but it's still not a distant memory. And at that point there still is not very Hollywood has not very much dealt with the Holocaust.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
right.
it was The Pawnbroker was probably the first place, and that really wasn't a Holocaust movie. It just sort of had a Holocaust backstory, and it was a long time before we got to Schindler's List and other films that sort of
Mhm.
address this in a really sort of powerful way. But this dichotomy of people can take it as a class struggle, as a character you root for from a lower class, from a working class to be with somebody in an upper class. And I think that's a story that is kind of universal. But then clearly there are people that are Jewish who find this shameful, and sort of address it at that level. And I think it's and this is a question to ask you, Michael. So is it that the way in which people take that different in the book or the movie are the same? That same sense of you either like it or don't like it for those reasons.
Oh, I think the reaction is basically, I think it's basically the same. And I think Bailey, you know, one of the things I was interested in asking him about was, you know, a lot of women have accused Roth of being, quote, misogynistic, right? And is that true of Goodbye Columbus? And I think he felt it was I think it was more a reaction on the part of the Jewish community to that book and movie than it was the other thing. Although, you know, he does say, you know, in the interview that I did with him, he really does say some extraordinary things about Roth, you know, in terms of women, you know. And one of the things he shared with me was, for one, the tell-all memoir, the 1996 Leaving a Doll's House, written by Roth's ex-wife, actress Claire Bloom, quote, permanently dinged him, Bailey says. And that's how, to this day, my biography notwithstanding, he's viewed by a majority of the public as this Machiavellian misogynist. And actually, Claire Bloom's book, and Bart, you're a movie buff, you know all about Claire Bloom. She was in Woody Allen's movie Crimes and Misdemeanors, for
Oh,
instance, right? I believe she played the wife of Martin Landau, the Martin Landau character in that movie. Apparently, this book is, you know, is quite is quite vicious, and Roth believes that Claire Bloom's book is the sole reason he did not win the Nobel Prize. He actually really feels that strongly about it. And what was kind of interesting to me in our conversations is that Roth apparently had very wonderful friendships with women, and many of his professional peers, you know, his agent and so forth. I mean, or the people close to him professionally were women. And then when he's dying, he's surrounded by women, right? But his marriages were catastrophes. That was the word Blake used. I mean, and they truly were. They were catastrophes.
Well, I want to get back to this in a minute. Before we while we're talking about the writing, I'm sorry I have not read the novella. How is the novella different from the film? Is there are there plot points that are different? Are there style
No,
issues that
I
are
think
different?
the story is basically the same. And, you know, I think you get a little bit more of a sense of the feeling of the Neil Klugman character, right?
Mhm.
The character. But there was a woman in Roth's life who was Brenda Patimkin. I mean, she wasn't named that, but she was basically the sole inspiration for that character, right? And I think for anyone who has seen the film but has not read the novella, I think they really should read it. I think I can see the National Book Award people, you know, I can envision them reading it and going, wow, this is great, and this is going to mark the beginning of a wonderful career. And indeed, it did. And one of the stories I use in my story
Mhm.
is there were these two landmark appearances in Dallas by Larry McMurtry, the great Texas author whose obituary I just wrote last week. And one of these appearances was at the Nasher Sculpture Center. I
Mhm.
can't remember the year. I don't remember exactly. But anyway, Larry's up there, and he was telling this story about for years how he wore this T-shirt that said minor regional novelist, but he meant it. Larry did not perceive himself as a great American writer. So somebody in the audience says, "Well, if you're not the great American writer, who is?" And without hesitating, he said Philip Roth. And and Bailey says, you know, Blake Bailey, the biographer, says he very much feels the same way, that Roth was the quintessential great American author.
Hmm.
So,
So let's go back to misogyny for a little bit, because in the film, we were talking about this before we started. If you remember the film, do you remember the first few images we have of the film? How does the film start off? It's a close up with a woman's stomach,
mhm,
right? Who is like sunburned, and within that first scene at the pool, when Ally McGraw like is introduced, how many close ups of her butt do we see?
mhm,
And of course this was made in 1969 and was very much a product of the way films were shot in 1969 in so many different ways. I
mhm,
mean, you can see many similarities between this and The Graduate, for example. Thematically and stylistically, there were many things in which there's some real comparisons to. But um, but this film is full of the male gaze.
mhm,
I
mhm,
mean, there are people who write books about this, and there are, feminine critiques of cinema where they talk about men looking at women's bodies, and
mhm.
and this film is full of that.
Do you think this film could a film like that be made today?
And I would say if this film were remade today,
Mhm,
I think it would look differently.
mhm,
I think the dialogue could all be the same. I think the events would be the same. But I think that it would not be portrayed in the same way. I think that women, and if you think about this, okay, and again, I'm not an expert on Philip Roth. Um, I've just seen the films. It's just my curse, of course. Um,
mhm,
so the women in this film, like the mother figure, the sister, most of the women are not treated that well. Ali McGraw's character, in the end, she doesn't do the right thing, right? And so she does not come off very well. Um, there is a documentary we showed in 3 Star Cinema called Mama Drama, which is a sort of history and aesthetic of women in Jewish films, right? And let's just say the Philip Roth films had a lot of appearances in there,
mhm.
because the Jewish mother figure is not held in high esteem in those. But then when you think about the Plot Against America, which
Mhm.
is a recent adaptation of a Roth film, and think about the women in there. Like the wife was just an incredibly rich character and
Right,
an important and a solid character,
right.
and not like it just is a very different thing. And I think it was very powerful. Now her sister, was problematic, but I think at least in this series, which
Mhm.
is sort of a modern adaptation of Roth, we get a much more nuanced approach to women's roles. And I don't know if that's in the writing or in the adaptation.
Well, what is also there's another fairly recent movie I thought of. The movie, is it Anthony Hopkins, where even though he looks white, he plays someone who apparently is black, and isn't Nicole Kidman in it? What is that movie? What is that called? Um, um,
Somebody will write this in the chat almost in a
yeah,
moment.
yeah. Anyway, yeah, anyway, that was different. I mean, I think that was a different kind of Philip Roth movie um, from different from Goodbye Columbus anyway, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Um, and of course, if we're going to sort of talk about um, that there's a sense of the sort of Jewish self-hatred, right? There is this stream of sort of Jewish art in general, music, film, of Human Stain. Is that the film you were talking about?
That's it. Yeah, very interesting film, I thought. I mean, and I think it's similar to The Plot Against America. It's kind of different from some of the earlier Roth books that became films.
And there is, within the Jewish community, there is a lot of people who are not so nice to other Jews in terms of the way that we treat each other. And
Mhm,
certainly, like, I think the class thing is sort of, which is to me like one of the key conflicts of the film, really important. And particularly, I mean, that era in the 60s was really, for in the Jewish community, there were a lot of people who, like the Potemkins, worked really hard in a business and started to make some money and
right.
would go to and would create the country club. They would have the Jewish country club because, the Goyim wouldn't let them in their country club. And so there was starting to be this like upper middle class Jewish universe.
Mhm,
And as soon as you get that, those people don't want anything to do with the people that they came from.
mhm,
Um, but to me, the most interesting part of this sort of Jewish self-hatred, which is like in there, and it's like it is part of Philip Roth's writing in general, and it's definitely part of this film. And
mhm,
it's okay. That's who he is and what he writes about, and he writes about what he sees, and he has an opinion about it.
mhm.
But there's one scene in this film to me that epitomizes that. Anybody have a guess what that is? The wedding scene.
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the wedding scene, is just truly, truly amazing. And so
Do you
I,
think it was overdone? Do you think it was excessive?
well, I've got a story about this.
Mhm, mhm,
So, just as you have been doing your writing and research into this, I happen to be teaching a graduate class this semester in editing. And while I was sort of prepping for this, I picked up a book that I read a long time ago called When the Shooting Starts, the Cutting Begins" by Ralph Rosenblum. Ralph Rosenblum was a very important editor. He edited a lot of Woody Allen's movies. He edited a lot of really important early films.
mhm,
And I just, after watching the film, I said, I think he has a chapter about this book. And he did. Ralph Rosenblum was the editor of this film. And he talks a lot about that scene.
hmm.
For There are two reasons where he talked about it, and I think they're both really enlightening. And by the way, if any of you are interested in the editorial process, there are two really good books. This When the Shooting Stops, the Cutting Begins, which is Ralph Rosenblum's book, and the other one is In the Blink of an Eye by Walter Murch, which
Mhm,
is just an incredible book about film editing.
mhm,
But that's another story. So the thing that he talks the most about is there's a character named, was it Uncle Louie? Do you all remember that character?
right.
So the actor who did that, like, was not very well known at the time, and this was like his big breakout moment. And the thing is that you don't know this from watching the film, but that scene was a much longer scene. And when in Ralph's telling of this, his performance in that scene as the brother of the guy who made it big and he didn't make it big was essentially the core of the movie. That it was like his brother, Uncle Louis, was like Richard Benjamin's character. He just, nothing went well for him. He was not going to do very well. And his opinion of his brother, who did do well, and his sort of, both sort of homage to him and disdain for him, is really sort of solidified in Richard Benjamin's character exactly what he was about to do. And so that it was like this incredibly powerful scene, powerful performance. But when they took the film to, when they had the cut and they brought it out to Los Angeles for the studio heads, they wanted it cut down. That it was like near the end of the film, and they didn't want to make a big deal about it. So we had to take this speech and sort of intercut it with this sort of flashback about what Richard Benjamin's character was thinking about, and essentially destroying what in Ralph Rosenblum's mind was the best performance in the film
Wow.
had to be like thrown out because of, you know, what the studio heads wanted in that particular
Wow.
time.
What,
Just
why did they want that though? Why did they want that
they
out?
just thought it wasn't important to the story, and it was not so much about what was going on, and they felt that at that point, and if you think about it, it's right near the end of the movie. It's
Mhm.
like
Right.
after the wedding, it's like they're off to college. They're in what is probably the worst looking hotel room in the history of cinema. I think the Bates Motel looks better than that room did. I mean, it's just like a very depressing room for a very depressing scene, to exist in. So that's one really interesting thing about it. And then the other really interesting thing about, if you think about that scene, like what really sticks out is there are those two girls that are perhaps a little bit on the chubby side, and the scene starts, by the way, with like the shot of the chopped liver, and like the guy takes it with his Ritz cracker and puts it in his mouth, and it's like, and you see this, you know, chopped liver sculpture, and already it's putting you in like, this is way over the top. And by the way, nowadays a wedding that would like be like small potatoes from what's, you know, going on now. But that, it starts off with that. But then there are these two girls who are a little overweight, and they are just like stuffing the food from the buffet. They're just like grabbing it and just, and then they go like run and dance for a few minutes. But in the initial cut, they just had that one time. What the studio wanted them to do was go back and have them three times. You see these women, these two little girls, like gouging this food. And if you remember that scene, there are so many people who are like in that buffet, just like eating like they haven't eaten in a week.
Mm.
And when you talk about the kind of Jewish self-loathing, it's like you can talk about how the different classes related to each other, but it's the scene there where, you know, and Michael, you probably have been to a Jewish wedding, right?
Oh, many. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
and
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 I did want to say that, Nancy and I have had three Jewish boys together, and so I've paid for three bar mitzvahs, which is why I so deeply appreciate the $10,000 honorarium you're paying me for this. If my editors are watching, that was a joke. That was a joke.
Right, you were not allowed to accept those things. If I could afford it, I would love to be able to pay. Let's put it this way: you're getting paid for this the exact same amount that I'm getting paid for this.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Um, but indeed, yes, and so, but you've put on those events, and they're not like that, right?
Yeah.
I bet at the bar mitzvahs you had, you didn't have anybody who was stuffing your mouth in the way that they were. But that is, you know, at that time, particularly again in the late '60s, and the novel was when, in the '50s.
59, 10 years
59.
before the movie.
Right. So there was that, like I was talking before, there was this emerging upper middle Jewish class, and that had very different values
Mhm.
of the people who were living in the Bronx, and such. And food, again, is very important to understand these differences. You
Mhm.
remember the scene in the beginning when Richard Benjamin is like, they're going to have his food, and they talk about, well, your uncle gets this and you get that and you get and I just have this, and they're like, can't we all just have one meal together? We're all eating the same thing, right? And in a Jewish family, like food is like a big thing. And then you go to the family dinner when he gets to go to the dinner, and it's not at all the same thing. And it's like what that dinner is like, it's halfway between the dinner Richard Benjamin was having and the dinner at Annie Hall's house in Annie Hall, right? Where in and there you have the actual split screen of the two environments between a Jewish and a non-Jewish dinner, you know, in that kind of way. Um, so what are the scenes that you think were important in the film? and perhaps, is there anything in the film that was not in the novella? Because as a novella, you don't have nearly as much story as you would in a novel, right?
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't really remember too many differences between the novella and the film. Maybe other people tonight will, but I guess because of the age that I was,
Hmm.
when I saw the movie, I was, like I said, a senior in high school when I saw it, and then it was shown to us again at freshman orientation, and because birth control was such a big part of it. I guess that that whole struggle between them was interesting to me at the time, right? And it was, but I mean, in terms of where I was and who I was in 1969. I mean, the whole Jewish aspect of the story was just very exotic to me. It was foreign to me. It was exotic. I felt like I was learning about a different kind of people, right? Certainly different from the ones I was surrounded by in Pleasant Grove. So, I mean, and that's what movies can do, right? Particularly when you're young, they can show you, like I did a story today about the reopening of the Angelica Theater in Plano, which I'm
Yes.
thrilled about.
Yes.
And just about every movie that they've got, this weekend is about a different culture. And one of the movies is Minari, which I guess you've seen, right? Which is, I think, a really good film, Oscar nominated,
Yeah, it's a great film.
terrific. And so, that is one of the great things that movies can do. For a high school senior, they can introduce you to a new world, a world
Absolutely.
you need to know more about. And that's what. And I would never have read the novella had I not seen the movie, right? And because it wasn't taught in my English class at Samuel High School, right? So anyway, the one of my Jewish sons keeps texting me. I wish he would stop that.
Wait,
But
wait, 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 wait. You're telling me that you don't want your Jewish son to be in touch with you?
well,
Are you sure you're Jewish?
as I told you, one of them moved to Israel on
Yeah.
Sunday, right? So yeah.
But it is indeed one of the roles of cinema is to show us a world that is beyond the world we know. And I think
Right,
that's really important. And
right.
one of the jobs of a filmmaker is to authentically show a world that they know to
Yeah.
other people. And one of the things in this three-star cinema that I run as a Jewish film series that is really sort of exciting to me is to watch, because I'm Jewish, I live in Dallas, Texas. When you see a movie about an Argentinian Jewish family and they're having a Passover Seder, or they're doing something at Hanukkah, or they're doing Jewish customs, and they're the very same thing.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
you just don't think that people living in a completely different part of the world
Right.
who are Jewish are doing similar kind of things. And so I always believe that there is this kind of like anthropological value of cinema, of seeing the way that people are in the current tense, but also were. It's like,
Right.
what were the things? A discussion about using a diaphragm is a very important plot device at that time.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't know how many people are still using diaphragms, if that is sort of a major thing. And how many people after watching that movie at SMU went to the health clinic the next day to
Hmm.
get themselves a
Right.
diaphragm? And how many of the women, when they went home, made sure they hid the diaphragm a little bit better than they might otherwise have done
Mhm.
after watching that film?
Bart, as we've been talking, there is a story that I keep thinking about, and I'm sort of debating in my head whether I should tell it or not.
Please do.
I think I'll go ahead and tell it because the principals in the story are no longer living, right? But it kind of goes to the heart of what, this Neil Klugman character in
Mhm.
Goodbye Columbus, he is, it seems as though he's both surprised and disgusted by Brenda Patimkin's family, which is so different from his family. And this weird story that keeps running around my head is that I worked at the morning news one time before from 76 to 78, but I left in 78 to join the staff of the Los Angeles Times.
Mm.
And the first thing I did there was I covered sports. I was a sports writer. So for the first 3 years, I covered the NBA. and there was a new team in San Diego, the Clippers, which are now in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And I guess it was 1980. I'm at a game in San Diego, and I look around and I see this gentleman standing behind me, and I said, "Are you David Halberstam?" And he said, "Yeah, that's who I am. That's me." And the great David Halberstam. And I was thrilled to meet him. And he was working on a book which became his first of many sports books called The Breaks of the Game,
Hmm.
which involved Bill Walton, who had gone from the Portland Trailblazers to the Clippers.
Right.
David and I became very good friends. I drove him around a lot, and we had known each other about a month when this particular thing occurred. I was in the sports media room on deadline, and I think I was the only one in there at the moment. And David comes in, and David is just ranting and raving and cursing. And I said, "What is wrong?" And he said, "I'm just so disgusted by the Clippers owner." It was a gentleman by the name of Irv Levin, a Jewish man, right? And Irv Levin, I don't know what his age was at the time. He's no longer living, but he was a middle-aged man. And I think he was a divorcee, but he had brought to the game his girlfriend, who looked to be considerably younger, who was very blonde. She looked, it was quite notice. The differences were very striking, let's put it that way. And they sat on the front row, of course, where the owner would sit. Well, the two of them were just pissing David off to no end, right? And he's going on and on and on and on, and he's literally complaining about the fact he's saying Irv Levin, he's Jewish, and this is so disgusting. And I said, "David, I mean, forgive me, you're Jewish, right?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, are you upset?" I'm playing amateur shrink at that point. I
Yeah.
said, "Are you upset because you feel that this is a reflection on you as a Jewish person somehow, and you're disgusted by this for that reason?" And he goes, "Exactly. Yes, I am." And he was appalled by it. He just couldn't. David was a man of enormous dignity and talent, and I mean, that was an eye opener to me. It was just really interesting to me, that he would feel that way.
And there are people that feel that way all the time. We had a screening for 3 Stars, the Jewish film series I run, of Uncut Gems. And there were some people on their way out of there who says, well, we shouldn't have films that show Jews like that.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that is, and if in a world where there is anti-Semitism and it is rampant, is out there,
Mm-hmm.
there is I certainly a stream of thought that we shouldn't be showing these images. It just gives people more ammunition to not like us. And there's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
deep strain. I mean, if you think about the history of Jews in film, you
Mm-hmm.
know, who were the studio heads? They were all Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
How many films of Jewish themes came out of that early era of the studio system? Almost none.
Mm-hmm.
The Philadelphia Story, how late was that in the game? Like, they don't deal with anti-Semitism, they don't deal with the Jewish experience. The Jews who ran the Hollywood system did not want to even be thought of as Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no Jewish content at all, which then again, when you have films like this where you have Jewish characters, some people would call them characters, some people might call them caricatures,
Mm-hmm.
which is a fair critique.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different than what we otherwise normally see.
Right. I don't know if I'm going to get any sharp disagreement from anybody about this, but in terms of the Brenda Patimkin character and the
Mhm.
way Ali McGraw plays her, I think she's a strong woman. I mean, I think the way that Ali McGraw plays her, I think she plays her in a strong way. I think, I thought it was a very good performance. She did win a Golden Globe for that. And
I think it's a great performance too. I really
yeah,
do.
yeah.
And her character, if you think about it, her character is strong to a point,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? I mean, she definitely stands up to her family to bring him into the house.
And she
She
stands up
definitely,
to him as well. Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
she stands up to him to bring him to for 2 weeks in their home. I mean, that's a big deal. That was, nobody in her family wanted that to happen.
Hmm.
And so she stood up against them. But when push comes to shove, she's not willing to give it all away. And given basically the choice
Hmm.
of this guy or her life, she went with her family and her life.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
So Michael, what's something we haven't talked about, and it's such a minor piece in the film, but they come back to it several times. So his job in the library. So he's got a job. He doesn't really dislike the job. He's kind of good at it and he's okay.
Hmm.
But what about this young African American kid who wants to see these pictures of Tahiti? What is that about? And does anybody know if that's in the novella as well, or was that a
I,
creation
I
for the
don't
film?
remember. I'm sorry. I just don't remember if it was in the novella, but I don't know. What's your take on that?
I think it's just Gordon says he's in the novella. Okay,
Right.
thank you,
Right.
Gordon, for that.
Yeah.
Gordon,
And my memory is that the novella really doesn't differ that much from the movie. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's sort of character development.
Mhm.
It's like it just sort of like, and particularly in the beginning of the film where you're just sort of getting to know him, getting to know his family in the Bronx, and like what his values are. Because in the end of the day, this book is about what you value in life, right? Do
Mhm.
you value money or do you value people, right? And so and what is important to you, and
Mhm.
then when you see him making this clear sense of sticking up for this kid who just wants to look at these pictures,
Mhm.
um I think that says something to his character, although it's unclear if that guy is just looking at this art, this little kid, is like a as something that's so different from the world that he's in,
Mhm. Mhm.
as he's looking at this for a sense of escape, um, and but he clearly goes out on a limb, and in a sense, risks, getting in trouble at work to give this guy a break,
Mhm.
right? And so, and in a way that, say, Ally McGraw is not willing to risk something for the guy.
Mhm. Mhm. I know women with whom I have discussed this movie, they really don't like the Richard Benjamin character, Neil Klugman, in the movie. They think he's a creepy person. They
Hmm.
they feel strongly about him. They don't like him. So
And
anyway.
why
Well,
don't they like him?
I think they just feel, I mean, it goes back to the misogynistic feeling or whatever that he's um, they don't like him for that reason.
I
So,
Well,
thought I thought he was worse at the end than she was. He kept saying you should have brought the diaphragm with you, and on, over and over, even though it was too late to do anything about it. And then I really felt he walked away. I mean, yeah, I agree about her as far as originally she wasn't seeming to be worried about getting pregnant, and then she's so worried about her parents at the end. So I mean, I agree. She made a bad move at the end, but I thought he was worse. So I thought he was awful.
and
yeah.
if
Yeah.
you think about throughout the film, is there any place in the film where he talks about her great intellect or her great charming personality?
Right, right. Yeah,
I mean,
Right.
what does he talk about? And what do we see? We see a close up of her butt. We see, and how many scenes in the film are about him wanting to have sex with her?
right.
And
Yeah,
interestingly, 1969, how many scenes do we see of any sex? None.
right.
This film, on so many levels, is about sex
Hmm.
with no sex.
Right, right. And by the way, speaking of, I wanted to share with you also, Bart, this thing here that Blake Bailey said to me about Roth, which I think it was in the context of of Roth's relationship with Claire Bloom, which did not go well. I basically said, why were his relationships with women so endlessly fraught?
Mhm.
And Bailey said, quote, Philip was highly sexed and he wasn't monogamous. And yet he loved the company of women, surrounding himself with, quote, formidable intellectual women all his life. His lawyers were women. His favorite editors were women.
Hmm.
Even so, he was promiscuous. He gleefully, sexually objectified women and made incredibly tasteless jokes about it, which he put into his work. Portnoy's complaint offering the most glaring examples.
Yeah.
Lastly, he married a famous actress who resented his adultery and abandonment and wrote a cut to the jugular book about it.
Well, I mean, I think that pretty much sums it up in a really, those issues are all there in the book. And, when you're a novelist, you write from the things in your head. And this, I think,
Mhm,
is a
mhm,
reflection of who he is as a character and the things that he like, but it's beautifully written and beautifully performed, right? I mean,
mhm,
it's a
mhm.
good film. It sort of touches us into the story of these people. But yeah, that makes sense. We haven't talked about the brother.
Oh, I have a story about him. I did some research on him today. That is such a great scene in the movie. I mean, it's remarkable. That Michael Myers is the name of the young man who played that part,
Yeah.
with the Goodbye Columbus record. And I was just absolutely kind of blown away, what I read about him. He I guess he had he had some chances to be in some other movies, but the really, in some respects, the experience of being in the movie was not the greatest thing in the world when it came to his life, because long story short, he ends up as an alcoholic and a drug addict, right? And he was going to begin medical school, and Goodbye Columbus came along in the summer between graduating from college and beginning medical school. He finds himself as a first-year medical student who's scared to death
Hmm.
whether or not he can make it or not. He also had what he called this phantasmagorical summer of being pampered and treated as a movie star.
Mhm.
The movie broke. It really got a lot of good play, good reviews. My character stuck out. I started to get acting offers. I had to make a decision whether to go back to a second year of medical school. Uh, Basically, he ends up as a drug treatment counselor after going into prolonged rehab himself. And at the time the LA Times did the story on him, I think he felt like he had turned his life around, but the movie kind of sent his life hurling in a completely different direction.
Yeah, I thought his character is just fascinating. And he's not at all much of a sympathetic character, although the thing when he just wants to sit down and talk is really kind of interesting. I I I, I thought it was interesting in the scene where he it goes Neil goes to work to where his father is working, and you see the guy just like telling people to load that stuff, load it quickly. And it was just really, there was something very odd about his presence in that moment. And then his father, when he's talking to Neil, is saying, well, he's not very bright. And so it's like Jack Klugman is like, well, my son's not very bright and you're not very rich, so
Mhm.
it's like, he doesn't have any male figures in his life, and clearly his own brother, Uncle Louis, is not somebody he wants to hang out with either.
Right,
So he
right.
doesn't have a lot of good like male people in his life to kind of to deal with. we've had a couple of interesting comments in here, and they're lengthy, so I didn't have a time to read them. So Russ and Leslie, would you like to sort of talk about what you wrote about? Russ, do you want to go first?
Come on.
Well, I guess I was afraid that what I said was covered by what you said, except for I suppose you were more charitable about that last scene than I was, because I thought she was clever. I thought that they both were, and kind of sophisticated, and it was just disappointing to me, and almost and a little bit implausible that she could have just completely become unglued. And and also I didn't blame the Richard Benjamin character for being frustrated with her and for saying, it means something. It wasn't unconscious. Excuse me, it was unconscious, but I mean, it was not insignificant that you left the diaphragm behind. You were trying to make something happen. You were trying to have them cleave us apart. So
do you think that indeed she either consciously or subconsciously left that out, and so that she could get caught and was a way to end the relationship?
yes, I mean, I agree with the Richard Benjamin character because there's no other explanation for it.
Yeah.
I mean, as he kept saying, just be honest with me. You know good and well that the only sensible thing for you to have done would be to stick it in your pocket. I mean, whatever, stick it in your pocketbook. The reason he kept repeating himself was because he just wanted her to tell the truth, and she wouldn't tell the truth.
Well, I don't think
That's what I think.
She probably didn't want to admit to that sense of a truth. I mean, it's probably, my sense is she's back at school, she's meeting other people, and he just does not seem as tempting as a diversion to being at summer with your family and having somebody that's completely different than everybody in your family, and it's something fresh and new, and now you're in this whole other world where that just doesn't like resonate at all.
I saw it much more simply, though. I thought it was simply a case of her not having the directions to the SMU Health Center. Sorry.
You mean at Radcliffe, they didn't have an orientation where they said,
Yeah.
here, put it here so you can have one here, so you don't have to bring the one back from.
Just another example of how SMU was much more enlightened than my wife's alma mater, Harvard,
Oh, I just had one other question.
Okay.
I want to know if anybody has ever heard of anyone under the age of, 50 buying a Mantovani record.
Or even knowing what that record might be. I mean, I think that is outside of the consciousness. I mean, and like to have the title of the film as a reference. I mean, the whole thing. Yes, that every time that music came on, it seemed like we were in a different universe, like an alternate place. Leslie, do you have a question you wanted to bring up or a point you wanted to make?
I was just mostly commenting, but I put a couple things down. I was just saying how I remembered my advisor in college kind of stunned me one day when he told me how much he couldn't stand Philip Roth.
Yeah.
But he was a big fan of Norman Mailer, who was like really outrageous. He had me read Why Were We in Vietnam, which is one long diatribe by this DJ, which was borderline pornographic, I would say.
So was this gentleman Jewish?
No, Italian Catholic.
Oh.
But Norman Mailer's Jewish, and he loved Norman Mailer. So I don't know, and he loved real rugged men, and he headed the John Steinbeck Center, and he loved Allen Ginsberg. He was an expert on the Beats, whatever generation, but he really couldn't stand Roth for some reason. And I have to admit what Michael was saying about Claire Bloom. I followed that a long time ago, and I sort of had sympathy for Claire Bloom. I'd forgotten she acted in Woody Allen stuff, but I'd heard he was kind of rough behind the scenes, but nothing like Mailer, who stabbed one of his wives, and he was just interesting. But oh, I think the other thing, a comment I wrote was other, when you were talking about Jewish self-hatred, I said other ethnic groups feel that way too. I really learn a lot on Facebook, listening to different people. I'm on with James Washington, who's edits a weekly newspaper, and he posts in his complaints all the time, pictures about young Black men who he gets furious with, like the way they dress and the way they talk and their manners. And, he's probably old enough mostly to be their father, but acts more like a grandfather or great grandfather, probably in their mind too. So it's not an exclusively,
There is
one
always
group.
this
Yeah.
dialectic between sort of loving your people and hating your people. And
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that is endemic to most cultures that are.
But I'm on
Michael.
with John McKay too, and he doesn't write the same things that James Washington does. He writes very different stuff.
So Michael, we've it was great. It was great talking to you for the last hour. What are you working on now? So what can we be looking forward to, the Sunday paper? What will you have in there that you're working on?
Well, let's see, what do I have? Well, there's this sort of investigative story I can't really talk about. What else? Well, the Philip Roth piece will probably run in print soon, even though it's online now. Oh, speaking of, I am writing a story about another new movie. By the way, I really highly recommend it, and you might even be able to get the filmmaker on one of these sessions. This woman that I'd met before, Tamara Saviano, she wrote a book a few years ago, a good book called Without Getting Killed or Caught. That is a lyric from a song by Texas singer-songwriter legend Guy Clark. And her new movie, Without Getting Killed or Caught, is about Guy Clark, his best friend Townes Van Zandt, another singer-songwriter legend, and Guy's wife, Susanna Clark. And all three of them are no longer living, sadly. But Tamara just did an incredible job with the triangle at the heart of this story. And I don't know what possessed her to do this, but she managed to get Sissy Spacek to be a part of the movie. Sissy Spacek is the voice. She got a hold of Susanna's journal entries, which are these incredibly emotional writings about Townes and Guy. And Sissy Spacek is the voice of Susanna Clark in the movie. This movie just won one of the top awards at South by
Southwest. I
Right.
saw the film at South by.
Oh, you did?
Yes, I did.
Oh, I think it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it's just, well, I'm going to have a big story on that.
What's the name of it again?
It's called Without Getting Killed or Caught. And by the way, it's got, there's a whole bunch of, if you were to Google it, there's like a bunch of, there's a bunch of screenings. This is a movie that was really hit hard by the
pandemic.
By the pandemic. It was supposed to be at South by Southwest last year, but we all know how that turned out. And so then this year it's all been virtual. Today is April 8th. The next screening, you can go to the withoutgettingkilledorcaught.com website. The next virtual screening is April 16th. And then they have them throughout the month. And then she's going to take it to theaters, right? And speaking of, there is another movie that I'll be writing about again, that's opening in June in theaters. Do you know this movie, 12 Mighty Orphans?
Nope, that one I don't know.
Okay, it's based on a book written by my college friend Jim Dent, who is in prison because of driving while intoxicated offenses. But he's had great luck with this book being turned into a movie, which stars Luke Wilson, Dallas's Luke Wilson, in the lead role. And the movie also has Robert Duvall and Martin Sheen. This is their first screen appearance together since Apocalypse Now.
Wow. Yeah.
This will open mid-June in theaters, and it's about Texas football. It's a true story about a Texas football team at an orphanage. So,
Sounds great.
yeah.
Well, guys, thank you so
Oh,
much.
Bart, I also wanted to I see a couple of my friends attended. I
Yeah.
wanted to say hi to them. Hi, Stephen. Hi, Lynn. How you doing? Thanks
Hi,
for attending.
Michael. You
How's
got
it
very
going?
dark there for a while.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's fun.
Thank you.
All right, guys. We'll see you next week. Next week is next week Nori's film.
Yes.
Okay, so you'll get an email about this, but Nori Niven, Dallas filmmaker, great filmmaker, documentary, a very, very powerful music documentary. And more on that in videofest.news, which will come out on
And
Monday.
Bart, I wanted to say thank you to you and Raquel. Thank you very much for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Well, Michael, it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Thank you.
It's great.
I remember all of them. Be well, guys. Thank you for spending an hour of your life with us. This was a really engaging and wonderful conversation, and we do this every Thursday night. So Michael, you can come back and see what else we're talking about.
Sounds great.